Hi, if you want to watch exclusive content with hot girls that you won't watch on YouTube, namely where Naruto roasts Kushina and Mikoto and many other hot girls without restrictions, then visit my Boosty channel at the link in the description.
She ran. Once again, she had to run somewhere. War was all around her. The battle was in full swing. But somehow, she felt like the Alliance couldn't win. The Four Shinobi World War, the fourth. Only this time, everything was different. The countries weren't fighting each other, but together against a common enemy. But did it make sense? Did anything in this world make sense? The Eternal Tsukuyami. I wonder what my ideal world would be like. Hikari, what are you standing there for? Forward! A man shouted from somewhere off to the side. The girl jerked and gripped the blade tighter. She rushed forward, after everyone. The wind blew her hair violently as she ran. Once again, she had to run somewhere. Even though it was already well into night, the girl's eyes were covered by dark round glasses. She never took them off. Even now, when no one cared about her, she continued to hide behind them, hiding herself from those around her. Though their group was far from the main battle, everyone understood perfectly well what was happening. But unlike most, Hikari had no idea what she was fighting for. The idea of eternal sleep had firmly taken hold in her mind, and the possibilities for what she could see within it clouded the battlefield. Events followed one another too quickly, and no one had time to fully grasp what was happening at any given moment. More than once, the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki's cloak had saved countless shinobi from certain death. But even that wasn't enough to secure victory. And so, after several hours of battle, the hopes of most were dashed, and the divine tree began to claim everyone, enveloping them in cocoons. For some reason, there was no fear. Hikari froze in place, and released the blade she had been clutching tightly all this time. White ribbons caught her fragile body, carrying her upward, while the red moon reigned in the sky. The girl opened her eyes. For some reason, she still remembered the war, the battles, but now it seemed distant, as if they weren't happening to her. Looking around, Hikari easily recognized her native village, Suna, hidden in the sand. People walked the streets, going about their daily business. Vendors from nearby stalls beckoned to customers. Children ran around. It was a place where she always felt like an outsider, where she could never be herself. Feeling sick inside, she wanted to leave as quickly as possible, and Hikari headed for the gate, breaking into a run. The patrolman at the main entrance ignored her and let her through without question. She ran forward, unconcerned about where or why she was going. But the further she walked from the village, the calmer her soul became. The endless desert, the blazing sun, the stifling heat, none of it could stop her. For as long as Hikari could remember, she'd always wanted to run away, to hide from everyone, but she couldn't. Strange, why? Now she couldn't even answer that question herself. After all, it all seemed so simple. She moved faster and further, wanting to get to a place where she could feel free, where she wouldn't have to hide anymore. She'd always dreamed of this, even though she had no idea such a place existed. There was no physical fatigue, as if she'd never experienced it. Only the mental exhaustion that had been building up inside her for years remained. Throughout her life, for 25 long years, breathing in the hot air, Hikari charged into the distance, running as fast as she could. Mountains, forests, fields, rain, the sea, she'd seen none of it. Now that she'd left the village, she had a chance to see more, to breathe in truly fresh air deeply. Gods, how she'd longed to feel the rain on her skin, something she'd never felt in Suna. To feel the drops of rain fall from the sky on her face. To see thunder and lightning split the sky. I wonder if, having experienced all this, I will be able to feel truly alive. All that was left was to check. All that was left was to run. How much time had passed? Unknown. The technique was dispelled, and the heavy branches crashed to the ground, releasing all the trapped shinobi. Hikari collapsed, exhausted. Her entire body ached, and her mind was crumbling. Even there, in the illusion of her dream, she continued to run. Her fists clenched the scorched earth beneath her, nails aching. And although under the Jinjutsu she had been able to accomplish what she had never accomplished in real life, even there she had no idea where to go next. Rising from her knees, she realized more and more clearly that she didn't want to be here. Not just on the battlefield, but in this world. She shifted unsteadily, moving forward like most people waking from sleep. A little further away, she spotted the reincarnated Leaf Kage conversing with a blonde-haired Jinchuriki boy and his ally, the last of the Uchiha clan. As she surveyed the scene, her gaze fell on a man lying motionless on the ground, yet for some reason everyone avoided him. Taking a few steps in his direction, Hikari realized that this man was the culprit of the war, Madara Uchiha, the one who had sent them into an eternal sleep that had never brought her any comfort. His head tilted to the side, and Hikari looked into his black eyes. She saw something achingly familiar in them, something she saw every day when she looked at herself in the mirror. Emptiness, loss, disappointment. Her legs moved toward him of their own accord. It seemed everyone was so preoccupied with themselves that they didn't even notice the girl kneeling before her fallen enemy. Staring into the man's detached eyes, Hikari couldn't tear her gaze away, her hands instinctively falling to his bare chest and glowing green. She didn't know why she was doing this. He would die anyway, like any Jinchuriki from whom the beast had been extracted. However, at that particular moment, she wanted to ease his pain, even if only for a little while. A pain she couldn't escape on her own. It's a pity that ninjutsu can't heal emotional wounds. The Uchiha jerked his head, looking at her with a puzzled expression. She wasn't just trying to heal his physical wounds. She was transferring her chakra to him. How stupid and pointless. Her mind was crumbling further and further. She no longer had the strength to run, nor the desire. For a moment, Hikari hoped she'd have time to transfer all her chakra to him, so she could die here, so she wouldn't have to return to her meaningless existence. The man's hand rose with difficulty, weakly grasping her wrist, causing Hikari to smile. His chakra was almost gone. The end was near. The Uchiha shifted his gaze somewhere behind the girl, and she half turned to look behind him. Her vision was gradually darkening. The young Jinchuriki and the first Hokage had only just noticed them, and were already rapidly approaching. Madara released her hand and performed a movement seal, taking her with him. Hikari collapsed backward onto the floor of the silent house. Feeling the cool wood beneath her, she turned her head to where the Uchiha lay next to her. Her chakra must have helped him perform one last technique before he passed out. Or had he died? Her vision was blurry, and she couldn't tell if her companion was breathing. But it didn't matter anymore. Everything ends. Closing her eyes, she smiled, feeling peace for the first time in her life. Finally, she was somewhere far away. Far from Suna. Far from people. She had escaped after all. Is this really not the end? Am I alive? My head was splitting. My body was aching. I had no strength. I wonder how much time has passed. Hikari pushed herself up with her hands and sat up. Her eyes tried to adjust to the bright sunlight streaming through the window, and the chirping of birds reached her ears. She took off her glasses and, pressing her palms to her face, rubbed her eyes. Her throat felt dry. Suddenly, a jolt ran through her body like an electric shock, and her mind began to reel back the recent events of her life. Hikari quickly looked down and saw the man who had brought her here. She instinctively jerked to the side, but immediately realized she was in no danger. The Uchiha was unconscious. Is he dead? Hikari slowly reached her hand to the artery in his neck and checked his pulse. To her surprise, he was still alive. By all rights, he should have died, but for some reason, life was slow to leave his body. She didn't know why this had happened or whether he would survive. However, for now, she was grateful for taking her with him as far away from his hateful past as possible. Hikari began to examine the place she was in. It was an ordinary wooden house, but it looked as if it had been built long ago but abandoned for years. A thick layer of dust covered the nearby kotatsu, the shelves on the wall, the large irori, the floor. Her gaze fixed on the window. Hikari gazed at the leafy trees swaying in the wind. It had been so long since she'd left Suna before the war, and had been able to see so much greenery. To savor it, she smiled involuntarily. These moments of peace were priceless. Rising with difficulty, Hikari found a blanket nearby and covered the man with it. It was hard to imagine what would happen next, but deciding not to dwell on it, she headed off to explore the house where she would clearly be staying for a while. There weren't many rooms here. A living room with an irori, a bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom with a small wooden ofuro. Approaching the kitchen window, Hikari looked out into the dense forest, obscuring what lay beyond. Her head was pounding, and something was pressing against her. She touched her forehead with her hand, and immediately felt the cold touch of metal against her skin. Pulling off the headband with the Shinobi Alliance symbol, Hikari tossed it into the first drawer she came across. She didn't want to see it again. She didn't belong to them anymore. A couple of weeks passed. Roughly. There was no clock or calendar to keep track of time. And what was the point when every day was the same? During this time, Hikari tidied up the house and established a routine. As far as she could tell, this place was far from the land of wind and deeply hidden from prying eyes. Going out hunting every day, the girl explored the area and never ceased to be amazed by the local fauna. She never saw any villages or settlements nearby. Everything here seemed like something out of her imagination. Not far from the house was a lake with a waterfall, its shore strewn with enormous boulders, the sound of the water rhythmically breaking the silence around her. The dense forest that surrounded her for many kilometers amazed her, with the abundance of both flora and fauna. Day after day, Hikari strolled and admired this place. For the first time, she was able to fully experience freedom. She wasn't even bothered by the loneliness. On the contrary, she relished it. Relished the fact that she could be herself. Although her companion on this strange journey was still unconscious, his condition hadn't worsened. She checked his pulse every day, and it remained weak. However, she saw changes in it. The first Hokage's face, emblazoned on his chest, grew fainter with each passing day. Hikari had heard of the former Konoha leader's regenerative abilities, leading her to suspect that it was thanks to his cells that the Uchiha remained alive. I wonder if he will survive. With each passing day, the weather changed, and autumn became more and more noticeable in the air. The leaves on the trees changed hue, painting the surrounding area in red and yellow. When the first thunderstorm broke, the girl immediately ran outside. She felt like a child, delighted by something so ordinary for many people. Standing in the pouring rain, soaking wet, she felt elation for the first time in years. It felt as if the elements themselves were washing away the past she had so longed to forget. After a few thunderstorms, Hikari preferred to wait out the storms indoors, sitting by the window and listening to the crackling of the logs burning in the irori, providing warmth. Although the girl gradually began to regain her composure, living in such conditions was not easy. She had to forage for food herself, and she washed and bathed by going to the lake while the weather still permitted. She was already beginning to think that she wouldn't have any problems with these things in the future. The fire techniques she mastered were quite helpful with household chores. She had no clothes other than what she was wearing, so she had to rummage through the closet. Everything here clearly belonged to a man, and, having borrowed some, Hikari spent her evenings altering them to suit herself. Over time, the girl became accustomed to the new lifestyle, and even began to enjoy it in a unique way. Routine activities that previously didn't require much time now consumed her entire day. The future was unknown to her. However, it didn't bother her now. Here, in this seemingly alien house, she finally found peace of mind. She didn't want to leave. Now she could be herself. She even stopped wearing her glasses, which she had only taken off at night in the past. Although her hands still involuntarily sought out this familiar accessory every morning. A little over a month had passed since Hikari had found a new home. Yes, home. It was a place she could now call home. The Uchiha was still unconscious, and the first Hokage's portrait had completely vanished from his body. But even after that, his condition hadn't worsened. On the contrary, with each passing day, his pulse became more and more noticeable, and Hikari began to wonder, what will happen if he wakes up? Will he kill me? Or just leave me here and go away? Will he try to carry out his plan again? And even though she didn't know the answers, somehow she didn't care. The last month had been the best of her life, and if her life ended after he woke up, then so be it. She had already enjoyed freedom from rules, prejudices, fears, and people. Hikari knew little about Uchiha, other than that he'd been resurrected and had started a war with his ally. Now she could only guess what had driven him to such actions, what he'd experienced long ago, and what he might want to do next. But the look she'd seen then on the battlefield had never left her memory. After going into the forest that morning and catching a rabbit, Hikari returned home to prepare lunch. She also found a supply of tea and a large bag of rice in the kitchen. Even though it had been sitting untouched for so long, it was still well preserved and clean. After a while, she completed the task and set the hot meat aside. Hikari rinsed her hands and the knife she'd used to butcher the carcass in a basin of water. As she turned to put the knife back, she dropped it on the floor. The dull sound of metal hitting would shatter the silence. Hikari froze, seeing the man leaning against the doorframe. It was easy to tell he was still weak. His dark eyes watched her intently. Hikari closed her eyes and instinctively fumbled for her glasses on the countertop. They stayed near the futon. How stupid I am. Although, what difference does it make? Taking a few deep breaths, Hikari was beginning to think she imagined him, but opening her eyes, she realized he hadn't. The Uchiha was still staring at her silently. Blinking slowly, she met his gaze, her thoughts racing through her head. "You're awake," Hikari said, breaking the silence first. Her words sounded like a statement of fact and didn't convey any surprise. She guessed this day would come sooner or later, since the Uchiha hadn't died in all this time. "Who are you?" Madara asked, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in ages. "Hikari." The girl introduced herself briefly, then glanced at the table behind her. "Are you hungry?" The man's eyebrows twitched, expressing silent surprise at her question. "Why did you save me?" Madara asked, confusion in his voice. Hikari closed her eyes for a moment, considering her answer. His gaze flashed back to her mind when she first approached him. "Did you want to die?" the girl said under her breath. For some reason, she was sure she knew the answer to that question. She'd had the same thoughts there, the same desire. He remained silent, continuing to stare at her. Maintaining his heavy gaze proved difficult. Picking up the knife from the floor, she placed it on the countertop and headed to the nearby shelves to grab a couple of plates. "What do you know about me?" Uchiha continued, without changing his tone. Hikari became thoughtful. "Probably almost nothing," she answered and shrugged. Grabbing plates and chopsticks, Hikari picked up the rabbit and approached the archway, deftly skirting the man as she made her way to the kotatsu. She set the table for both and sat down, tucking her legs under her. The rabbit was still warm, and Hikari carefully began serving herself. Glancing briefly at the Uchiha, she saw him turn and walk toward her. He stopped next to her, looking up. "And you just stayed here?" A hint of bewilderment and confusion flashed in his voice. "I have nowhere to go," Hikari replied calmly, without raising her head. "If you don't plan on dying, eat." She nodded at the meat and continued filling her plate. The Uchiha stood next to her, but even without seeing his face, Hikari felt his penetrating gaze on her. After a minute, he finally took a few steps and, without a word, sank down onto the zabuton, taking the seat opposite her. The day Madara woke up, the girl brought another futon from another room and spread it out near the Irori, next to her own. It was getting cold outside, so it made sense to spend the night near a source of heat. For the first few days after waking, Madara felt extremely weak, which caused him to sleep a lot. He rose occasionally during the brief periods of wakefulness only to relieve himself or eat. Food, she always left a portion on the table for him, even when she left. As his body gradually recovered, his mind began to clear, and the only question that lingered in his head was, "Why am I still alive?" It was driving him crazy. Madara had always had a purpose, a meaning, something to live for. But he had nothing else. He had lost. Who was he now? A ghost of an old war? A man with no place in the new world? And most importantly, what to do next? But he had no answer to any of these questions. Memory returned him with enviable frequency to his conversation with Hashirama after his defeat. The realization that he had been wrong in his judgment devoured him from within. For the first time, his confidence wavered, collapsed, shattered into countless fragments. Attempts to rethink the years of his life increasingly drew him back to the old days and plunged him into a depth of reflection. This house. It had been so long since he'd been here, he'd almost forgotten what it looked like. After leaving Konoha, he traveled extensively and watched as death and war enveloped the world. Everything he'd seen only strengthened his belief in the wisdom of his decision. It was then that he settled here, far from everyone, and began plotting his plan to plunge the world into eternal slumber. He'd later left this house to attack his once native village, never to return. But for some reason, lying on the cold ground after his defeat, he remembered this place. After another week, his body had almost completely recovered, and the need for constant sleep had disappeared. Madara began to increasingly observe Hikari, who lived with him, but seemed completely ignorant of the fact, though she continued to silently cook for them and keep house. Straight black hair just below her shoulders, dark glasses, average height, well-built, like most kunoichi, nothing remarkable, nothing unusual, but only in appearance. Otherwise, she definitely had to be different from the others, otherwise she wouldn't be here. Madara had already gotten used to the fact that the girl spent almost the entire daylight hours outside the house, returning only for lunch with her latest catch or a small animal she had killed in the local forests. "Sit down and eat before the food gets cold," Hikari called to him so measuredly and smoothly, as if they had lived here for years. Variations of this phrase were heard every day. And every time he approached the kotatsu after these words, Madara stared at her as if hoping to read her like a book. But the miracle never happened. She always ate silently and tried not to meet his gaze, even though she wore glasses. And she wore them all the time. When the sun was setting, she would come, add some firewood she'd brought to the airori, and reheat the food. After the meal, she'd sit by the window and gaze into the darkness of the evening forest. Now, on top of all the others, he was preoccupied with yet another question. For what? Why did she save him? Why did she stay? Why wasn't she afraid? That was something he clearly didn't understand. But Madara was in no hurry to ask, preferring to put off the conversation until something settled in his head. He was used to analyzing everything, but her actions and subsequent actions defied explanation. Try as he might, he couldn't understand her motives, which made him doubt she had any at all. Having finally recovered, Madara began to leave the house. Finding his old clothes in the closet, he couldn't help but notice that the girl had already tidied them up and cleared them of years of dust. For what? That question again. Squeezing his eyes and pinching the bridge of his nose, Madara tried to push aside thoughts of what was happening, if only for a moment, and focus on what to wear. A few kimonos, pants, a couple of sweaters, he'd have to. Over the past few days, he'd even recognized some of his own clothes on the girl, even though they'd been skillfully altered. He didn't comment on her rummaging through his closet without permission. They were just clothes. Walking through the forest strewn with fallen leaves, he traveled further and further each day, rediscovering long-forgotten places, a waterfall flowing into a small lake, a cliff overlooking the endless forest, a nearby cliff where, in the warmer months, a multitude of berries ripened. Inhaling deeply, Madara seemed to be looking at the world for the first time and trying to remember what it was like to be truly alive. Here he encountered something he had never expected: silence and tranquility. Thoughts in his head continued to ask questions and torment his mind, yet an ephemeral feeling of peace. This unfamiliar feeling, which had been visiting him for several days during his walks, frightened him. All his life he had fought, struggled, made plans. And now what? Sit at home, listen to the crackling of the fire, watch someone cook. It seemed as if this was not his reality. His thoughts once again hit a wall of confusion. How to live on. And most importantly, why? Maybe I should leave? But he had nowhere to go. He was everyone's enemy. Someone he now associated only with fear and destruction. Though Madara vaguely remembered how he'd managed to transport himself here, he knew that for most people, he'd escaped the battlefield alive. They were probably even looking for him. Although, that was unlikely. By all rights, he should have died. But somehow, he remained alive. For what? He was already starting to get tired of this question. Madara remembered perfectly well how the war had ended. How his life's plan had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. How he had been betrayed and deceived once again. But now other moments from those days came flooding back to him. Moments he couldn't ignore. For the first time, people had united, setting aside their enmity and self-interest to stand against him. The war had ended. But for how long? Madara increasingly recalled Uzumaki Naruto's impassioned speeches during the battle, painfully similar to those once spoken by Hashirama. That youth had united the shinobi world and never wavered in his ideals. Now Madara had the opportunity to recall their meeting again and look at the situation from a new perspective. But despite this, he couldn't help but grin whenever Uzumaki's words about world peace flashed through his mind. Even now, after everything, Madara doubted it was possible. To maintain this fragile peace, one must be prepared for anything. That's what strength is for. I wonder what's up with him now. Madara headed toward the house, when the sun had already set behind the hills, but it was still far from the horizon. He was sure Hikari had already returned, as he couldn't sense her chakra anywhere in the area. With every step, he felt uneasy. The lights in the windows were on, allowing him to make out her silhouette. Madara paused at the entrance and winced. It all seemed too strange. Taking a deep breath, he finally opened the door and stepped inside. The house was warm. The aroma of baked fish mingled with the tartness of wood smoke. The silence was broken only by the footsteps of bare feet and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Peace. Comfort. Even after a week, he couldn't get used to it. Again, it felt like a dream, not reality. Not his reality. It angered him, but he couldn't tell which. The fact that she had breathed life into this house, or the fact that he couldn't accept it. Taking a few steps towards the hall, he looked at Hikari, who had already sat down at the kotatsu, her gaze fixed on the dish in the center of the table. Sit down before it gets cold. A soft voice cut through the silence and hit me in the head. Madara clenched his fists and exhaled loudly. Why? Why did this irritate him? I'm not hungry, Madara answered dryly, even though it was a lie. He headed for the back room, which was now tightly closed to retain heat. Finding a fur cape in the closet, Madara took it and went outside again. For some reason, he didn't want to go far, even though he clearly needed more space. Sitting down on the steps near the entrance, Madara raised his head to the sky, where the first stars were already beginning to appear. It was getting dark. Silence. The sun had set and no longer gave off warmth. Steam billowed from his breath as he exhaled. Inhale. Exhale. Madara clenched his teeth until they gnashed. For what? He didn't understand why Hikari continued to care for him, and did so naturally, effortlessly, as if it were normal that they were here. Never before had anyone treated him like a normal person. Madara wasn't used to this. It seemed strange. Fear, hatred, respect, recognition, he had always sensed and known how others perceived him. and he was used to manipulating it. Before, the clan wanted something from him, then Hashirama expected something from him, and then he himself demanded that he achieve his goals. Madara always controlled everything, calculated everything, but she simply lived nearby and asked for nothing. Her behavior was out of the ordinary. She didn't fit into the familiar world. It was infuriating. Madara guessed the girl had a secret. She had to. Otherwise, why would she stay here? Why didn't she just go home? If she was with the Shinobi Alliance, that meant she belonged to one of the hidden villages. Although it was unlikely they would have accepted her after they'd seen her with him. "I have nowhere to go," Hikari said in their first conversation. But why? There were plenty of other places they wouldn't look for her. It was confusing. Feeling an unpleasant rumble in his stomach, Madara winced and glanced at the house. The lamps had already been extinguished, and only the reflection of the Aurori flame shimmered in the windows. Rising, he stepped inside again. Warmth, comfort, it all seemed to burn his skin. Madara tossed his cloak onto the nightstand near the entrance and headed toward the living room. Hikari was already asleep, her blanket tucked over her head. His gaze lingered on the girl, and Madara pursed his lips. For what? Confusion plagued him. The pleasant aroma of food made his stomach clench. Looking at the kotatsu, Madara saw a teapot, a cup, and a plate with half a fish on it. She'd left him some more food. Sighing wearily, he headed to the table, eager to eat as quickly as possible, and then fall into a sleep where he wouldn't have to search for answers. Over the next few days, rethinking his own life and ideals faded into the background. They crumbled and turned to ashes. The past no longer made sense, and the future still defied comprehension. Because of this, Madara found himself increasingly focused on the present. Spending evenings at home, he continued to watch Hikari closely, carefully observing her every movement, trying to find an answer to at least one of his questions. She cooked, cleaned, brought water, but paid him no attention. He heard the sound of her footsteps, saw her roll up her sleeves while cooking, or wince as she adjusted the sparks in the Aurori. Day after day, Madara found himself staring at her longer than he should have. Returning from a walk, his gaze immediately scanned the room, checking to see if she had returned. He distinctly smelled her scent, which seemed to have become a part of this house. One evening, Madara realized he had memorized her every movement, every gesture, but he still knew nothing about her. This angered him. For several nights now, Madara hadn't been able to sleep properly due to nightmares. His mind seemed to be reminding him of the events in his life he tried so hard to forget. Waking up in the middle of the night again, he immediately went outside and looked at the stars. Silence. Peace. His thoughts returned to Hikari. He had plenty of opportunities to question the girl, but something held him back. Madara always figured things out on his own. He wasn't used to asking. It seemed that if he voiced the questions that troubled him, he would give himself and his emotions away. Show that he cared. Why didn't she speak to him first? Why didn't she ask anything? Why didn't she demand an explanation? Her actions defied analysis, and that irritated him. Hikari awoke at dawn. The logs were nearly burned out, making the house feel chilly. Rising quietly from her futon, she immediately put on her glasses and adjusted her yukata before heading to add more wood. Glancing briefly at the sleeping man, Hikari tensed. More than 2 weeks had passed since he'd woken up, and now everything was different. It was foolish to deny it. At first, she carefully ignored his presence and continued her usual routine, but a hint of tension began to twitch inside her again. There was another person in the house now. She wasn't alone again. She regained control of herself. She became cautious again and put on her glasses again. She was losing herself again. It was irritating. Even though Uchiha limited himself to short sentences, Hikari felt him watching her. She felt him there. She noticed that every time Uchiha left, she sighed with relief, and when he returned, she regained control. It felt like the perfect world she'd built within herself in that short time was crumbling. Hikari considered leaving more than once, but her fear of the outside world had taken a firm hold. This house had become the first place she'd felt at peace. And now she no longer wanted to lose what she'd gained, even though she'd gained it thanks to Uchiha. Perhaps that's why she continued to leave him food and tea. Somewhere deep down, Hikari knew that if it hadn't been for her impulsive action after the war, which at that point had only brought a desire to die, she would never have experienced freedom, never felt like herself. And she was grateful to him for taking her, though he likely did so unconsciously. When the fire in the hearth flared up with renewed vigor, the girl stood up and looked again at the sleeping man. How much longer will he remain silent? This can't last forever. Sometimes she thought about speaking first, but somehow it felt too early, as if he wasn't ready. Or was it she who wasn't ready? That's why she remained silent. However, the obsessive thoughts about a possible conversation grew stronger with each passing day. Hikari had spent her entire life hiding, concealing herself, remaining silent. She was used to it, but that was before. Now she didn't want to return to the old ways. All these days, Hikari had been carefully glancing at the silent man when their eyes couldn't meet. She'd listened to his footsteps when he was home. She'd seen him watching the fire in the Irori. She'd felt him watching her. She'd heard him get up and go outside at night. And so she could no longer deny the reality they found themselves in together. It had become unbearable. Realizing she'd been staring at the man for too long, Hikari hurriedly went to change for the hunt. After putting on pants and a warm sweater, she glanced at the fur cape in the hallway, the one the Uchiha usually wore when he left. After a brief hesitation, Hikari finally picked up the warm garment and draped it over her shoulders. I clearly need her more now. The fresh air steamed as she exhaled, and the girl shivered. Winter was fast approaching, though there had been no snow yet. After living in the heat of Suna, the cold was unusual and difficult to adjust to. Rushing forward, Hikari hoped she would return with her prize without freezing to death. Uchiha was home, sitting by the Irori when she returned. Warmth. Finally, Hikari looked at the frozen hands holding the fish. Even fire techniques hadn't been able to warm her while fishing. After shedding all unnecessary clothing, she stepped onto the warm wood and headed to the kitchen. With some difficulty, Hikari managed to finish the fish. Her fingers ached from the difficult work, but she didn't mind. It was a worthy price for the peace she had found here. When everything was ready, she collected the utensils and headed into the dining room. Setting the plate of food down on the table, she glanced briefly at the man's back and sat down on the zabuton. Sit down and eat, Hikari said calmly, suspecting that she was unlikely to hear an answer. Uchiha glanced at her half-turned and only after a while sat down opposite her. They ate in silence. Again, this was becoming unbearable. Hikari periodically glanced at the man through her glasses. It seemed to her that something in him had suddenly changed. His hand froze, his gaze fixed on her plate. Involuntarily, Hikari's grip on the chopsticks, held with exhausted fingers, tightened. What is he thinking about? Without showing it, Hikari continued eating and carefully considered how to start talking. Talking to someone who didn't want it. And was it even necessary? Lost in her thoughts, she didn't even notice Uchiha finishing his meal and carrying his plate to the kitchen, after which she heard the front door slam. He was gone. Again, Hikari exhaled and took off her glasses. The sun had almost set, and Uchiha was still nowhere to be seen. It was too cold outside to go out without the cloak the man had taken. She didn't know if he would return. However, if he didn't, she would have to find something else to wear outside the house for the next few months. Sitting by the window, Hikari watched the changing weather and the wind blowing leaves across the ground, irreversibly losing their vibrant colors. The silhouette of a man appeared unexpectedly, causing her to freeze, watching in surprise as he approached the house, holding 2 dead quails in his hands. The slam of the door brought Hikari to her senses immediately. She jumped up and ran into the hallway. Her gaze darted between the man and the prize in his arms, and her lips twitched, revealing a faint smile. Deftly throwing his cloak off his shoulders, Madara glanced at her, lingering longer than usual, then took off his shoes and headed for the kitchen. Somewhat shocked, Hikari didn't immediately follow him, and only after several minutes finally crossed the threshold. Madara was already standing at the table, plucking birds. Every movement was precise, as if he'd done this many times before. "Thank you," Hikari said quietly, almost in a whisper. For a moment, he froze at the words of gratitude, but didn't respond. The man returned to his work, and the girl headed for the irory. There was no longer any desire to look out the window, as if there was no need. Hikari stared into the fire, and wondered what had prompted him to this decision. What had prompted such a change? The confusion was paralyzing. "We need to talk." A while later, Madara returned with a ready dinner and set the table. She didn't expect him to invite her, so she immediately sat down and picked up one of the birds. Hikari was glad that at least this evening she didn't have to cook. Having finished eating, she headed to the kitchen and returned with hot tea. Filling the cup, Hikari clutched it tightly in her hands. "It's time." "It's very tasty, thank you," Hikari said cautiously, looking at Uchiha through her glasses. "You don't have to hunt tomorrow." "I'll do it myself," he said, not taking his eyes off the dish in front of him. "Okay," Hikari said, frantically gathering her thoughts. "Are you fully recovered yet?" "More than," Madara answered calmly, and glanced at her from under his brows. That moment was enough for her to see in his eyes the same confusion she'd seen on the battlefield. But now there was something else in him, something she hadn't had time to grasp. Taking a sip, Hikari didn't know where to begin. All the questions that had been swirling around in her head for days seemed to evaporate. "Why didn't you send me away?" Hikari blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Madara looked up at her and looked at her carefully. "You said you had nowhere to go," Uchiha answered calmly, reminding her of her own words. "Why didn't you kill him?" The phrase came out naturally, on the exhale. "Do you want to die?" Madara asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. Again he returned her own words to her. "Not anymore," Hikari admitted honestly. "I'm happy here." And indeed, her thoughts were now far removed from death. Life seemed to have acquired color, just like her. Madara stood up and, taking the dishes with him, headed to the kitchen. "Apparently, this conversation is over for today." After looking at the man through the doorway one last time, Hikari went to bed, deciding that by morning she would definitely get her thoughts in order and ask more than these two stupid questions. Wrapping herself in a blanket, the girl almost instantly fell into a deep sleep, although it was more like a nightmare. She dreamed again of Suna, the war, and the atrocities that had once ravaged the village. She hid again, fled again. All the houses looked alike, and because of the sandstorm, she couldn't find the main gate. She couldn't find a way out of here. Jumping up from her futon, Hikari's eyes flew open and immediately met Uchiha's gaze, who was sitting by the window. He froze, staring at her, his eyes wider than usual. Still half asleep, Hikari didn't immediately understand what was happening, what was going on, her thoughts still lingering in the nightmare. Only a minute later did she comprehend everything and squeeze her eyes shut. "You?" Madara began, surprise flickering in his voice. "Uchiha? I thought everyone died during the massacre because of Obito." "No," the girl answered sharply, trying to return her eyes to their usual dark color. "I never belonged to the Uchiha clan or Konoha. I grew up in the village of Sand." Madara was silent, but she felt him still looking at her. Her heart was pounding. Opening her eyes, she forced herself to look up at him. "Now there's definitely no point in me hiding. So how did you end up in Suna?" Madara asked calmly. "I was born there." "You know what I mean," Madara said, not backing down. Hikari pursed her lips, feeling the shadow of the past creeping back into her memory. "It's a long story," Hikari said in a low voice, hoping to put this conversation off. "It's night too," Uchiha said and looked out the window. "Or are you in a hurry somewhere?" She didn't want to talk, but she no longer had the strength to run from the past. Realizing there was no way to avoid the conversation, Hikari crossed her legs beneath her and pulled the blanket up over her shoulders. It felt more peaceful that way. In those ancient times, Suna and Konoha were enemies and often engaged in open conflict. One day, a wounded leaf shinobi burst into my mother's house, apparently seeking shelter, but lost consciousness almost immediately. She struggled for words. My mother couldn't leave him to die and helped. Surprisingly, he didn't try to kill her after waking up. On the contrary, he was grateful. After that, he began visiting her, though it wasn't easy. After some time, she became pregnant, and he died during another battle. Hikari paused and looked at the fire in the Irori, where recently added logs were clearly burning. My mother knew he was from the Uchiha clan, so when I was born and grew up, she constantly reminded me that I had to control myself and that no one should know the truth about my heritage. She was the one who gave me the glasses in case I lost control. She was especially worried when I entered the academy. My Sharingan hadn't manifested yet, but I dreaded it every day, knowing nothing about these eyes, what they did, or how they were created. And then news came that the entire Uchiha clan had been killed by one of their own. I was 14 then, I think. This completely crushed my mother, who was already struggling to bear this secret. Her worries intensified, and she feared that they might come for me too. Because of this, I was forbidden to go anywhere unnecessarily or to communicate with anyone. It was like isolation. All I had left were missions, which I went on less and less. And a year later, my mother was killed. Her voice wavered, and a lump rose in her throat. She was robbed and beaten by some drunk shinobi from our village, after which she died, bleeding from her wounds. The girl snorted. Absurd. To die at the hands of the one who was supposed to protect, and to love the one who was supposed to kill. In this world, everything is upside down. Covering her face with her hand, Hikari rubbed her eyes and took a deep breath. And then what? New missions, war. No one knew I had the Sharingan. In fact, I hardly used it. Years of fear had taken their toll. I constantly hid myself and didn't allow myself to get close to anyone. People betray you all the time. Believe me, I know. Even after the truce between the lands of fire and wind, I couldn't live any other way. I wanted to run away, but the unknown was just as frightening. After all, I wouldn't have been able to open up to anyone, no matter where I was. All of this was depressing and immersed me in not-so-kind thoughts. I was tired of existing, of pretending, of hiding. I guess I'm just weak, since I couldn't handle it. I couldn't even run away. I did it, Madara said clearly. Hikari looked at him in confusion, clutching her hands tightly under the blanket, trying to suppress the trembling caused by the unpleasant memories. But despite everything, she felt lighter. As if the burden she'd been dragging behind her had finally been left behind, somewhere in the past. For the first time in her life, she could tell someone everything without fear. Through the dim light, she couldn't see the man clearly, but she was certain she had nothing to fear. He didn't even move, simply continued to stare at her silently. Why aren't you sleeping? Hikari asked carefully. It seemed that right now, after her frankness, she might give more than a monosyllabic answer. We should have added some wood to the fire, Madara replied calmly. Winter will be here soon, and there will be snow. We should prepare in the next few days, so we don't run out of firewood and food. To think, that's exactly what he wanted to say. Is the winter long here? Hikari asked, tilting her head slightly. Not very, but quite severe. Something in his voice changed. He was still calm, but now somehow different. I need to get some sleep. Tomorrow is a hard day, Madara added and headed to his futon. Fine. Hikari watched him go, then fell back onto her pillow, completely confident that nightmares would no longer plague her mind at night. Madara woke before dawn and immediately went hunting. This routine, something he'd been accustomed to since childhood, was a welcome relief. Walking across the frozen ground, he listened to every rustle around him, searching for prey. But the forest seemed to be asleep, enveloping the area in silence. Over the past few days, he had begun to get used to the calm around him, which calmed the storm within him. Perhaps fate had spared him for a reason? He kept returning to pondering how to live on and what to do, and the current situation was perfect for that. At some point, Madara caught himself not wanting to leave this place. For the first time in many years, he was free of everything: plans, goals, anger. For the first time, he tried to allow himself to savor the silence surrounding him. Even Hikari's presence somehow no longer bothered him. After a spontaneous conversation in the middle of the night, he couldn't stop thinking about her story. It had clearly been difficult for her to hide her origins all these years, hiding without anyone to share the burden. And constant loneliness has a detrimental effect on the soul. He knew this better than anyone. The sun rose above the horizon, awakening the surrounding countryside. Hearing the crackling of branches, Madara saw a deer slowly emerge from behind the hill. It should last for a while. Taking out a kunai, he crouched down and quietly walked towards his prey. Although Madara hadn't butchered such a large animal in a long time, his hands remembered everything. Situated near the house, he knew Hikari had been watching him through the window the entire time. Rinsing his hands with well water, he grabbed some of the meat and headed into the house. It was warm. The scent of tea hung in the air. Madara closed his eyes for a second and inhaled deeply. The deer is so big. Where are we going to store it so it doesn't spoil? Hikari asked cautiously, peering out from the hall. There are different methods and even a couple of techniques. There's no need to worry about that, Madara replied calmly. That's good, the girl smiled. I've never lived in such places, and frankly, in such conditions either. Madara looked at her carefully, but feeling the blood from the meat begin to trickle down his hands, he immediately headed for the kitchen. Turning around, he noticed Hikari had followed him and stood behind him. Can I help you with anything? Hikari asked. No, Madara replied, but the unpleasant sensation from his own harsh tone made something inside him twitch. You should study the area better so you know where to hunt. Yeah, Hikari said hesitantly. You? After we eat, I can show you around. Madara interrupted, realizing that she was unlikely to be able to handle this task on her own. That would be wonderful. Even though Madara couldn't see it, he was sure the girl smiled. A quick glance back confirmed his thoughts. Hikari returned to the Airori, and Madara continued cooking. It still struck him as odd that she and Uchiha had chosen to save him, although it was hardly a rescue, since even he didn't know he'd survive, and what he remembered hardly resembled a rescue attempt. Madara placed the meat on the kotatsu, where fresh tea and cups were already set. Hikari was throwing logs on the Airori, and upon seeing the man, she immediately headed to the table. Have you learned to use the Sharingan? Madara asked, lowering himself onto the zabuton. It can help with hunting. Not really, Hikari replied, her expression clear that she was surprised by the conversation's start. I tried not to use it, except during missions in critical moments, so no one was able to expose you. Madara continued, cutting off a piece of meat. Everyone who could is already dead, Hikari replied quietly, her hand shaking. But perhaps it's for the best. Who knows what would have happened to me then? They probably would have locked me up somewhere, interrogated. It was only with Gaara-sama's arrival that things began to improve in Suna. It wasn't the best place to live before. Madara looked at her. For the first time, Hikari no longer had her glasses on, allowing him to see all the pain hidden in her gaze. Why did you try to save me? Madara blurted out, realizing he'd been avoiding the question for too long. You know what I did. She hesitated and looked up. I saw your look then. I thought I understood. I just wanted to help you. Maybe I don't understand the motives that led you down this path, but even though I was forced to fight alongside the Shinobi Alliance, somewhere deep down I wanted to fall asleep and wake up in a better world. You managed to find him in the illusion? Madara remained reserved, though he couldn't deny that her words had struck a chord deep within. No, unfortunately, Ikari said with a smile. Perhaps that's why, when I returned to reality, I completely lost hope for the best. Even when I gave you my chakra, I hoped. The girl fell silent and looked down. It's strange. It was here that I was able to experience the peace I dreamed of, and I don't have to hide. Madara looked down at his plate, feeling for the first time like he could understand someone. He'd felt that way too, over the time he'd spent here. As if this very place could heal the soul. Were you thinking of leaving? Madara asked. Settle in a small village somewhere and live there? Now? Madara nodded. I've thought about it, but I don't want to. I'd have to hide who I am there too. People probably wouldn't care, but I do. After so many years of running, I first need to figure myself out and figure out how to move on. I'm afraid of how people might react to me if they find out the truth. I've had situations like this before. The girl fell silent. Madara looked at her, silently expecting her to continue her sentence. Ikari put down her chopsticks, hiding her hands in the sleeves of the large sweater that had once belonged to the Uchiha, and sighed. I had a friend. The girl began, closing her eyes. We'd been together since childhood. We entered the academy together. We started going on missions together. He was the closest to me and knew about my mother's dire mental state, though he had no idea what caused it. Ikari pursed her lips, which trembled. Sometimes you think you know someone well, but then it turns out you don't. When we were on a mission and taking shelter from a storm in one of the caves, he started hitting on me. As soon as I pushed him away, he hit me and tried to do what he had planned. That's when the Sharingan first manifested. At first, he was scared, but when he realized I had no idea how to use it, he continued, only now threatening to tell everyone that my mother was a whore and had fathered a child by an enemy. Ikari's voice dropped to a whisper, and her eyelids clenched tighter. I'm not a completely weak kunoichi and wasn't ready to give up. Throwing him away, I stabbed him in the chest several times, then burned his body and returned to the village. Now I think I should have run away back then, avoided all the interrogations, and not made up stories about my partner dying on a mission. But I couldn't leave my mother. She wouldn't have been able to handle it. Ikari opened her eyes and looked at Madara. This story had clearly taken her a long time to tell. Though she didn't shed a tear, her gaze said much more. It clearly conveyed all the fear and horror of this event, which had not only convinced her of the need to hide herself from others, but had also completely undermined her faith in people. Madara frowned and glanced toward the Airori. He'd seen all sorts of people in his life, manipulated them, played on their weaknesses. He knew what they were capable of. But for some reason, now the images that began to surface in his mind weren't those he despised, but the opposite. Izuna, Hashirama, people from his clan, even Obito, who had been different when they first met, not the person he had become because of him. Not all people are the same, Madara said, returning his gaze to the girl. I'd like to believe it. Ikari replied softly. You're the first person I've been able to share this with. Madara looked away. Those words had stung. After Hashirama, he'd never allowed himself to be open with anyone again, and he knew how heavy that burden was to bear. But Ikari began hesitantly. What prompted you to come up with such a plan? Madara didn't immediately return his gaze to the girl. Though he'd expected this question sooner or later, he still wasn't prepared for it. No, he remembered and understood all the reasons perfectly well, but talking about it to someone, that was much harder. Fragments of his life floated through his mind one after another, the most unpleasant ones, the ones that had left more than one scar on his heart. Madara grimaced. I've seen too much bad and experienced enough to become disillusioned with people and this world," Madara said, trying not to show his emotion. Genjutsu was the best solution to finally stop the endless wars. He saw something he'd never seen before in Hikari's eyes, understanding. The girl looked calm, as if they were discussing something mundane. It seemed as if the wall they'd each built up over the years was slowly crumbling. Tilting her head to the side, the girl asked, "Do you still think so?" "No," Madara answered monosyllabically. He was afraid she'd ask, "Why?" because he couldn't quite answer that question himself. To his surprise, Hikari didn't ask any more questions and simply continued eating in silence. The girl was the first to leave the table, taking the dirty dishes with her. Madara settled down near the Irori and sipped tea, occasionally glancing at Hikari, who was rinsing the plates. She kept tilting her head to the side, clearly lost in thought. Madara couldn't stop analyzing everything. It was hard to break this habit, which had become part of him. Staring into the flames, he was so lost in thought that he didn't even notice the girl sitting down on the floor next to him, cup in hand. "Do you think they're looking for us?" Hikari broke the silence. "I don't know," Madara answered ambiguously. "Most likely, everyone thinks I'm dead. But in any case, no one will find us here. This is neutral territory, and there are no settlements nearby." "That's good," Hikari whispered. Madara looked towards the window. "Get ready. You need to see the hunting grounds before the sun sets. But we have one warm thing, like we—" "Take the cloak for yourself," Madara replied calmly, catching the girl's puzzled look. "I think I had another one." Commentary on Part 5. Understanding. My Telegram channel, where I post about my work, art, and all sorts of other stuff lizard. https://t.me/aftersunset_hami Part 6 Shards A couple of days passed, and it was already bitterly cold outside at night, but there was still no snow. Even though Madara had said he would hunt alone, the girl still expressed a desire to accompany him on this difficult task. Even though they were alone, Hikari didn't use her Sharingan. She clearly had a hard time accepting this part of herself, which had filled her life with fear. "Have you been to the river yet?" Madara asked. "I've been there a few times before it froze," Hikari replied calmly. "But I don't really see how you'd catch anything now." "I set up nets there last night. I need to check them," Madara said, gesturing in the direction. "It's the easiest way right now." Madara half turned to look at Hikari, who was walking beside him, gazing at the slumbering forest. The birds no longer sang, only the frozen grass and branches crunched underfoot. It seemed as if life had left the area, leaving them alone. "I don't know how I would have survived here alone, to be honest," the girl smiled sadly. "You would have survived," Madara said sharply. "You managed to hide in Suna for so many years, but if you ended up here, you probably wouldn't have given up so easily." The girl looked at him in surprise, her eyes wide open. "Why do you say that?" Hikari asked, her voice laced with confusion. "Because you never gave up, even though you don't admit it," Madara replied, looking away. Hikari had spoken of her weaknesses more than once, but from what he'd learned of her, she wasn't. In his life, he'd seen many people truly broken by past trauma. Some committed suicide, some turned to religion, but few were able to remain truly themselves. For some reason, he now realized that he was little different from those he despised. Unable to cope with the loss of his brothers and parents, Madara closed himself off from people and became obsessed with saving the world. He suppressed all emotion, devoting himself entirely to the goals he had set for himself. Madara always pushed forward, demonstrating strength and superiority, but his confidence was nothing more than a mask, protecting him from further suffering and loneliness. His steadfastness was an armor that shielded him from fear and doubt. The bank of a small river appeared ahead, and as he approached, he stepped onto the ice. Madara immediately headed for the ice hole. Having pulled in several large fish that had been caught in the trap, Madara smiled involuntarily. Without realizing it, he had been increasingly enjoying the simplest things lately. Now, being away from it all, it was as if he had regained the ability to notice such insignificant details. "Is the ice strong?" Hikari asked cautiously, stepping carefully behind him. "Quite," Madara replied, rising to his feet, holding his prey in the net. "Have you never seen ice?" "Only in the fridge." The girl giggled. Madara watched her silently. Hikari smiled, her gaze darting around as she hesitantly treaded the slippery surface. Pushing lightly with her foot and spreading her arms, she skated across the ice, her smile even wider than before. Watching her, he couldn't help but think back to his childhood, when he and his brothers would go to the river. Although where he came from, winters were milder, and the river rarely froze. When it did, they always came to skate and fool around. These short forays between battles helped them forget the world around them. Madara smiled faintly. Gliding more nimbly now, Hikari retreated along the riverbed, her cloak slipping completely from her shoulders, leaving her behind. Madara watched her fall as, unable to keep her footing, she fell backward onto the ice, which instantly broke under her from the impact. Hearing only a brief cry, he tossed his catch toward the shore and immediately headed toward the girl. Approaching, Madara stopped near a fissure where nothing could be seen. Quickly analyzing the situation, he could see no other solution but to dive after it. Throwing off his clothes and remaining in only his pants, Madara shuddered, and sparks of flame blazed from his mouth as he exhaled. Leaping into the icy water, Madara plunged into the depths. Thanks to his Sharingan, he was able to easily find the girl, who was inevitably being pulled to the bottom. Grabbing Hikari's hand, he began to surface. Looking for a rift was pointless, so, concentrating chakra in his free hand, Madara broke through the ice above him. Reaching the surface, he pulled out Hikari, who had likely lost consciousness due to shock from the icy water. Surprisingly, she was breathing, meaning there was no water in her lungs. He immediately wrapped her in his fur cape and laid her on her side. With intense concentration, Madara managed to raise his body temperature, causing the moisture to quickly evaporate, and only then did he begin to dress. Looking at the girl's blue lips and pale face, he frowned. "She even survived the war, but she could have died so stupidly." Lifting Hikari into his arms, Madara went to retrieve the catch and the cloak the girl had dropped. Hurrying to the house, he went inside and set Hikari down next to the irori where the coals were smoldering. After lighting more logs, Madara settled down next to her. The girl still hadn't regained consciousness. All he could do was wait. Madara looked into the fire. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd saved someone. Had that ever happened? Even Obito, buried under the rubble after the avalanche, had been nothing more than part of his plan. A pawn. It wasn't saving her for the sake of. And why had he saved her? Just like that? He never did anything simply. There was always a reason. But not now. Madara sighed heavily and leaned back, feeling the pleasant warmth emanating from the tree beneath him. He thought of his family again. Yes, perhaps it was then, for them, that he was ready to do anything, and it wasn't fueled by the pursuit of any particular goals. Everything had been different then. Madara understood, felt something changing within him, even though he resisted it. It was all too strange. It felt as if emotions and feelings buried somewhere deep were bursting to the surface, forcing him to act without reason. He wasn't used to this. He'd forgotten what it felt like. The world around him had changed, and his past ideals were shattered into pieces. It felt as if he were back at the beginning of his journey, as if he could begin anew. Hikari coughed sharply, and Madara straightened up. She winced, clearly trying to focus her gaze on the spot she'd found herself in, then slowly sat up. She was trembling and clutching her cloak tightly, burying her nose in the fur. Madara watched her silently. When Hikari finally came to her senses, She looked back. "Thank you for getting me out," the girl said hoarsely. "I don't think I'll be walking on ice anymore." Hikari smiled awkwardly and shuddered again. Madara's lips twitched, wanting to smile back, but he held back. For the first time in a long time, someone had thanked him. Just like that. "You need to change. Your clothes are all wet," Madara said reservedly. Rising from the floor, he decided not to disturb her. Besides, he needed to tend to the fish that had been lying by the entrance all this time. Taking his catch, the man headed to the kitchen. The aroma of fried fish mixed with brewed tea quickly spread and filled the house. The girl had already changed into her yukata and was sitting near the irori, trying to finally warm up. Seeing the hot food and tea, Hikari smiled. Both of them were hungry from the long walk, so they immediately began eating. Madara saw her glance at him, clearly about to ask something. It was only after a while that Hikari finally made up her mind. "Why did you save me?" Hikari asked, her curiosity clearly evident in her gaze. Madara didn't know what to say. After thinking for a moment, he said, "Why did you save me?" It wasn't a question, because he remembered Hikari's answer, and he was once again returning her words. It was an impulsive act. He wasn't thinking about anything else at the time. He simply couldn't let her die. Hikari clearly understood what he meant and smiled, looking down. "Thank you for everything," the girl said quietly. "There's nothing to thank me for," Madara replied dryly, sorting through the fish on his plate. "That's not true," Hikari said firmly, shaking her head. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. You helped with the hunting, and you saved me from a stupid death at the bottom of the river today." Her words were smooth and serene, yet filled with confidence, and a slight half-smile played across her lips. Madara chuckled. "I think you are the only one in the whole world who is able to thank me for something." "Most likely," Hikari said timidly, smiling even more than before. Madara squeezed his chopsticks until they cracked. Strange. It was too strange. Looking at the peaceful face opposite him, he couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken to anyone like this. Without purpose or reason. In their time together, he'd never caught her pretending. She was always honest. Sincere. As if experiencing freedom, Hikari no longer pretended. Not to herself, not to him. "Why don't you judge me? Aren't you afraid?" Madara blurted out. "You don't know anything about me, what kind of person I am, or what I'm capable of." He'd thought about it many times, but he couldn't find the reason for this attitude. Madara grew tired of guessing and finally voiced the question that had been tormenting him with incomprehension. Hikari froze, staring at her plate, and tilted her head to the side. She always did that when she was thinking. Once again, Madara realized he'd memorized another of her habits, causing his brows to furrow. Only after a couple of minutes did she look at him calmly. "Who am I to judge?" Hikari began. "Even though I still don't know the reasons why you even came back from the dead, you clearly had them. You're an ordinary person who can choose a path and make mistakes. We've all made them, but I guess when we choose a path, we can't know if it's the right one. We can only test it." The girl fell silent, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "And what's right anyway? Is killing enemy shinobi right? Why? They're the same people there. It's all subjective, and everyone sets their own boundaries and lives within them." Madara pursed his lips. Every word she said resonated with him, making him uneasy. She didn't judge, but did she really understand? It was strange. "Well, I don't see any point in being afraid of you," Hikari continued more cheerfully, as if trying to move on from the unpleasant topic. "You could have killed me many times already. Even from afar, I've seen what you're capable of. And if you had tried, I doubt I'd have been able to escape. But since I'm still alive, that means you're definitely not the ruthless maniac they said you were on the battlefield." Madara involuntarily raised an eyebrow, staring at the girl, who had buried her face in her plate and was continuing to eat with a smile. Was she joking? Madara chuckled. You become bolder. Commentary on Part 6. Fragments. My Telegram channel, where I post about my work, art, and all sorts of other stuff. Lizard. https://t.me/aftersunset_hami Part 7. First snow Only nearing sleep did Hikari finally warm up. It felt like every bone in her body was frozen solid. She barely remembered what had happened after diving under the ice. It was as if her brain had instantly shut down upon contact with the icy water. However, she clearly recalled the emotions she had experienced beforehand. That naive and unfounded joy that filled her was